June was hot, cloudless. Clear blue sky and the seeming serenity of the sea even more strongly, sharply emphasized the extremely tense state of people, focused, stern faces of the military, anxious eyes of women, frightened children's faces. But Sevastopol continued to fight. It was the 8th month of the siege. In heavy battles with the enemy grew hatred of the fascists, hardened the will of the people, and the desire to protect the Black Sea stronghold at all costs. In the first days of June, Hitler's troops again in all directions intensified the onslaught on the defending Sevastopol. But especially strong artillery fire, frequent bombing raids, attacks of tank units and infantry fell on the north side. This testified to the enemy's desire to establish control over the entrance to the northern and southern bays. Our ships were still entering, delivering ammunition, replenishments to military units, food for the besieged, medicines. In return trips from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk and other ports of the Caucasus, sailors took the wounded and local residents, mainly children and women. In order to paralyze the supply of Sevastopol, the enemy undertook a concentrated attack, seeking to break through to the northern bay, from which it was possible to keep under heavy fire all the main approaches to the city. One of the undesirable obstacles for the enemy on the way to the northern bay was the 365th Anti-Aircraft Battery, located in the area of Mackenzie Mountains, on the height of 60.0. The commander of the battery was Senior Lieutenant N. Vorobayev. From the first days of the Hitlerite offensive, the anti-aircraft gunners were firing at the enemy tanks and infantry by direct fire. The position where the battery was located made it possible to fire in any direction of the approach to the bay. It is impossible to count how many tank assaults were reflected, how many ominous machines with black crosses on the armor were hit, how many attacks were thwarted at the request of the army men. Hitlerites suffered heavy losses, but they were striving at all costs to seize the dominant height. On June 7, the battery commander Vorobayev was seriously wounded. At night he was sent to the hospital, and on June 8, the enemy came almost closely to the battery, half circling it. Many were killed at the guns. Almost every one of the living was wounded, but the will of anti-aircraft gunners to resist the fascists could not break. On June 8, Lieutenant Efim Matveyev, the commander of the control platoon, took command of the battery. He was drafted into the army from the reserve soon after graduating from Leningrad State University. In combat, Matveyev proved himself a brave and skillful commander. Being on a remote adjustment point, the lieutenant chose the moment when armored personnel carriers and trucks with Hitlerites came to the only road that ran along the hollow and reported the coordinates to the battery. The accuracy of firing was marvelous. At night from June 8 to June 9, the enemy shelled the battery with artillery and mortar fire. And in the morning, the German aviation made assault strikes on anti-aircraft gunners' positions. About 10 showed 4 tanks, followed by a battalion of infantry. But even this attack artillerymen repulsed. In the battle, especially distinguished gun commanders Communist Sergeant Stepan Danik and Ivan Streltsov, who fired direct fire. Communist Petty Officer Commander Anton Shkoda also distinguished himself with the Red Fleet men, organizing them into a mobile firing group. That day, Lieutenant Efim Matveevich was hit by a shell shrapnel and his right arm was broken, but he continued to lead the battle. By the end of the day, a direct shell hit collapsed the ceiling where Matveev was. When the lieutenant was released, he could not hear anything and could not see well. At night, Efim Matveevich was carried away and sent to the hospital. On June 10, at night with 2 sailors, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Pyanzin, appointed commander of the 365th Battery, snuck into the battery. Ivan Semyonovich Pyanzin had not yet had time to recover from the events he had experienced at his own 80th Battery. The day before, after this battery shot down several enemy planes, the Germans made a group raid on it. On Pyanzin's command, anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. 1 Junkers was shot down. The rest of the bombers dropped bombs on the battery. No sooner had Junkers disappeared from view as the hurricane bombardment began. Communication with the command post of the division was broken. The battery stopped firing. Division Commander Captain E.A. Ignatovich, concerned about the silence of the battery, went on a motorcycle to the positions of anti-aircraft gunners. Terrible was the picture he saw. Devastated guns, around killed, seriously wounded. The explosions of bombs and shells caught the gun crews in action. Only at night it was possible to take away the wounded. The battery was completely put out of action, but the enemy for 3 more days intensively bombed and shelled the battery that no longer existed. Pianzin and surviving soldiers before leaving equipped false positions on the place of the destroyed battery. And at night from June 10 to 11, Ivan Semyonovich took the 365th battery. Attacks of the enemy did not weaken. Hitlerites did everything to destroy the battery sooner and to open the road to the northern bay to Inkerman area. June 12 came, and this day began with artillery and mortar shelling, air assault, and then under the cover of a heavy tank infantry went into attack. The Germans were shouting, firing machine guns. Anti-aircraft gunners hit the tank. None of the fascists did not approach the battery. All fell on the approach to the firing positions. The gunners were left with 1 firing gun and 1 anti-tank gun. About midnight, 2 sailors arrived at the divisional CP to Captain Ignatovich with a report from Pianzin. The senior lieutenant reported that there were 25 wounded on the battery who had to be hospitalized. There was no water, food and fuses for grenades. An hour later, the commander sent to Pianzin 6 sailors, but physically strong, savvy, excellent with small arms in hand-to-hand combat. They took with them a barrel of water, bread, breadcrumbs, canned food, fuses for grenades. The group was commanded by a paramedic of the division. They went to the Bratsk cemetery by car, and then the barrel with water was rolled, and we carried the cargo on ourselves. Before dawn, we managed to carry all the wounded to the area of Bratsk cemetery, from where they were taken to the divisional CP. There the wounded were given the first medical aid, and then sent to the south side to the hospital. June 13 began with a new attack of Hitler's. This time they managed to break through to the firing position. Ivan Streltsov hit a tank, but that shot was the last. By a direct hit, the gun was put out of action. Ivan Streltsov was seriously wounded. Ivan Pianzin hit another tank with an anti-tank gun. It was hard to understand how the battery commander was still holding. The senior lieutenant was badly wounded at dawn. He lost a lot of blood. And the Germans had already approached the gun yards. The anti-aircraft gunners, those who could still keep on their feet, went hand to hand, and Pianzin began to dictate a radiogram to radio operator Besanov, which was transmitted in plain text. There is nothing to fight back with. Almost all the personnel is out of action. Open fire on our position and command post. The radiogram was received by the division commander Captain E.A. Ignatovich. Eugene Andreevich, now a colonel of the reserve, remembers all these events well and writes in his letter, "I had to fire twice on the 365th battery. The first time in December days, in the days of the second offensive on Sevastopol. The enemy then also managed to block the battery. The fascists occupied the barracks, trenches, approached the firing position. The chief of staff of the regiment, now retired Major General I.K. Semenov, ordered me, I was commanding the 54th battery at that time, to open fire on the barracks and on the approaches to the firing positions where Hitlerites were. Our battery was on the height of 53.0, 600 meters east of Malakoff-Kurgan. From the height we could see the whole north side and Mackenzie Mountains, the barracks of the 365th battery, and firing positions. The battery fire was commanded by myself. Being in the center of the firing position, through binoculars I watched the bursting of shrapnel shells. They were bursting in the places where the enemy was concentrated. Few fascists managed to escape. During the firing, the gun barrels got hot, and to cool them down, the gunners stuffed their shirts with snow and covered the barrels with it. So it was in the December days of 1941. Here is an excerpt from the award sheet presented by the head of the Saur Air Defense, Colonel Kurbnikov and Regimental Commissar Konobritsky. 110 ZAP, led by Colonel Matveev and Military Commissariat Battalion Commissar Kovzel. For 5-6 days was almost the only force preventing the capture of the north side by German troops. The mass heroism of soldiers and commanders in carrying out the order not a step backward. The steadfastness and persistence in battle, and the huge losses inflicted on the enemy testify to the correct and skillful management of the battle of the regiment commander Colonel Matveev. Personal courage and bravery in battle firm, that unswerving fulfillment of combat orders are characteristic features of Colonel Matveev. So the heroism of the defenders of Sevastopol has rightfully become the property of history. However, not all the heroes who stood to the death at the ancient sea ravelins are known to the readers. Very little is said, in particular, about those whose labour and courage made much for the immediate defenders of the naval base. I mean military builders, whose hands under continuous enemy fire was built more than one defensive fortification, built more than one pier, where ships arriving from Novorossiysk and other ports of the Caucasus coast were unloaded. But especially difficult was the construction of piers in the last days of the defence of Sevastopol. Here is one of the episodes of heroism and courage of military builders. Especially for the construction of the pier in Kamishevaya Bay used pontoon floating copter. The pier turned out to be about 30 meters long, with a minimum depth of 5 meters with 2 exits to the pier. Here in Kamishevaya Bay, the builders equipped an evacuation hospital protected from shrapnel, but it could not accommodate all the wounded delivered in those days for evacuation. During the day, the ships could not enter the area of Kamishevaya Bay. Enemy scouts were always watching the bay and the surrounding area. Despite the camouflage, the bay was continuously bombed. Artillery fire did not subside day or night. As darkness fell, the soldiers of the 95th Construction Battalion hastily restored the pier so that the arriving ships could unload and take the wounded. The former chief engineer of Sevastopol Construction, now engineer colonel of the reserve S.I. Kangan, not once. I. Kangan told me more than once about the courage of the military builders. In one of the last days of June, Kangan was ordered to urgently choose a place and build additional piers. On June 27, Semyon Ignatovich arrived in Cossack Bay. Having examined the shores, they found a shallow place and installed mooring bollards made of rails. During the night, one of the operational moorings was finished, but it was necessary to build a berth that would allow immediate access to the sea. The place suitable for such a mooring was the area of the 35th Battery. Now this bay is called poetically and very peacefully Blue, but at that time it was decided to build an L-shaped berth here. It was mainly designed for minesweepers. The depth of the berth was 4.5 meters. The total length of the berth was 80 meters. On the shore, 100 meters away from the berth, without any shelter, logs were used to make rows of logs. Wreaths of 6 by 6 meters were well seen by the enemy, and that's why Hitlerites bombed and shelled the place of construction day and night. It was necessary to work round the clock, in the hardest conditions. Considerable losses were at builders. Colonel Engineer Semyon Iosifovich Krivitsky was directly in charge of the works on installation of the piers. The construction of the pier was carried out by the 95th Separate Construction Battalion and the personnel of construction on D1. Many builders gave their lives in the construction of this pier. With difficulty, they installed one row between the shore and the rock, 40 meters from the shore. Kangan decided to build a suspension bridge to fill the rows with stones, which he immediately calculated for the load of wheelbarrows with stones. To lay this bridge, Kangan had to swim himself and one builder to bring the end to the eyelet and then stretch 2 25mm ropes, on which a light planking was arranged. The row portion of the pier was never finished, and the temporary suspension bridge was used for landing evacuees. Under enemy fire, the second part of the pier was also built on consoles made of scraps of rails embedded in the rock of the shore. These constructions became the last berth for minesweepers, patrol ships and boats, the last residence of the port commandant's office. On the night of July 3 had to his eye, Kangan had to swim with 3 comrades to the watch boat on a log, a fragment of a row. It is firmly remembered that maintenance of berths, creation of minimal conditions for acceptance of ships in besieged Sevastopol cost huge efforts and many sacrifices. People gave their lives so that the ships could approach, unload, receive the wounded, and leave in time. It should be recognized that the fascist Borghese in this case does not admire the actions of his subordinates. He writes Nessan net 2 Russian naval lifeboats south of Cape Kikinais. The crews of the 2 torpedo boats engaged them in battle. The Russians on the dinghies were armed with machine guns and automatic rifles. The fight at a distance of 200 meters lasted about 20 minutes. The torpedo boats received minor damage, and the commander of one boat, Pascolo, lost his left arm. So I found another confirmation that 2 torpedo boats of the glorified Italian flotilla retreated in front of 2 Soviet dinghies. Fedorov scouts, having won the battle with the enemy torpedo boats, took a course for Sevastopol. 2 hours later they were detected by an enemy submarine. It tried to attack the boats, but our sailors did not keep waiting. They immediately opened fire and shot down an officer who appeared on the deckhouse of the submarine. The submarine disappeared under the water and was never seen again. The boats returned safely to Sevastopol. So ended an unprecedented duel of 2 of our boats, on which were 18 scouts, with 4 boats and 1 submarine of the enemy. All 18 heroes: Nikolai Fedorov, Sergei Melnikov, Georgy Kolesnishenko, Vasily Kavashenko, Ivan Pankratov, Krasnodid, Azup Izmailov, Anatoly Kulinik, Gavy Azhov, Kulikov, Gurov, Stepan Gernyak, Alexander Ivanov, Viktor Novitsky, Vladimir Gorbyshchenko, and Vice-Volod Ivanov were awarded orders and medals. The group of Midshipmen A. I. Popenkov landed in the area of Yalta, successfully completed its task and kept the direction to Sevastopol. But of the 11 people passed the front line, only 5, including Popenkov himself, crossing the front line near Sevastopol in late June, when there was intense fighting, an unprecedented case. Senior Lieutenant Fedorov, soon after returning to Sevastopol, was given the task to blow up the flagship command post after the command had left. Fyodorov fulfilled this task, but when retreating to the Chersonese Cape, he was killed in a fight with the enemy. On the night of June 17, another group of scouts from the 47th Army landed on the Kerch Peninsula to reconnoitre the villages of Bulganak and Adzimushke. The Army headquarters had data that in the quarries of the peninsula are hiding military units that did not have time to evacuate during the withdrawal of the Crimean Front units. To divert the enemy's attention, gunboat No. 4 and 2 sea hunters of the Azov military flotilla shelled Cape Krony and Shirokaya Golka. The landing was carried out by Mo 19, where the commander was Senior Lieutenant Nasreddin Askarov. According to the plan of the operation, part of the scouts had to return by dawn, and Askarov stayed to wait for their return. The appointed time passed, but the boat with the scouts did not show up. Full dawn came. Nasreddin Askarov did not leave. He waited. Then he decided to approach the shore, but the boat was shelled from machine guns and mortars. The wounded appeared. The commander of Mo 19 was forced to return to Temryuk. In these days from Sevastopol to Tayman arrived part of the reconnaissance team under the command of Battalion Commissar V.E.S. Koptilov. They were tasked to gather information about the enemy and his preparations for the landing on Terman. I knew Vasily Stepanovich Koptilov from the battles in besieged Odessa. In those days he was the commissar of one of the volunteer detachments of Marines. The fearless commissar was loved for his cordiality and closeness to the soldiers, for his touching care for the wounded. He was not long in the detachment then. In one of the counterattacks he was seriously wounded. And here in June 42nd, he was again on the front line, in Taman. 2 army reconnaissance groups landed on the Kerch Peninsula did not receive a single report. Koptilov's detachment was instructed to find these groups or find out their fate. The scouts went to sea on 2 sea hunters. The 3rd Mo 4 was to provide artillery support. Here is what the participant of the operation midshipman Fedor Fedorovich Volonchuk told me shortly after this campaign. I went with my scouts on the lead sea hunter, the 19th. As soon as the shooters passed midnight, they began to prepare for landing. To the landing place, 300 meters. We had to go by dinghy. We got permission from Koptilov to disembark. We got into the dinghy, put rag-wrapped oars into the oars. We were to approach the shore unnoticed, scout it, if everything would be quiet. On our signal, the main group was to start landing. 15 minutes later, the scouts heard the sound of the surf. And suddenly the shore, which seemed lifeless, lit up with fire trails. Ambush? The enemy did not have enough stamina. In some 5–10 minutes, coming close to the shore, the scouts would have started landing. Then nothing would have saved them. But Hitlerites warned the group in time. The boats turned back to the boats. Koptilov and commander of Mo 19 Nasreddin Askarov, having evaluated the situation, gained speed and approached the shore, covering the boat with a smoke screen and shelling the shore with cannons and machine guns. They gave the scouts an opportunity to leave without losses. On June 20, after a fierce battle which lasted all day, the enemy, supported by tanks and aircraft, managed to occupy the northern coast of the northern bay, except for 3 strongholds: the Konstantinovsky-Ravelin, Mikhailovsky Battery, and the area of the engineering wharf. The strongholds were created by decision of the Commander Vice Admiral Oktyabrsky from the 95th Rifle Division that had suffered losses, coastal defense units, local rifle regiment and air defense units. During the night, the Konstantinovsky Ravelin installed one 130mm and two 100mm guns, brought to them 30-40 shells. A 122mm cannon, an anti-tank gun, and 25 shells to it were delivered to the area of the engineering wharf. At night, the southern shore was strengthened. An armoured train Sheleznyakov was pulled up to the power station to shell the north side. The enemy installed on the north side of the artillery and mortar batteries that shot the northern and southern bays. According to the summary of the headquarters of the Sevastopol defensive area on June 26, can be judged on the situation on the land Sevastopol front. The main blow the enemy was striking at Inkerman direction. All night and all day parts of the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division, the 8th Brigade and the 3rd Marine Regiment repulsed fierce attacks. Under the influence of superior enemy forces, our units were forced to withdraw to the south. It is now known how the enemy felt in those June days of the 42nd year. In his memoirs, Manstein admits that in mid-June 1942, despite the advance of Hitler's troops, achieved at the cost of heavy losses, the fate of their offensive hung in the balance, to strengthen the troops storming Sevastopol. The German command was forced to pull up from the Kerch Peninsula 46th Infantry Division, and in the second half of June to begin the transfer of individual units from various compounds of the 17th Army, operating in the Donbass. In these days, Hitlerites did everything to sweep off the face of the earth those who resisted them, who prevented to advance to the coast of the northern bay. Here is what Captain E. Ignatovich, who was in those days on the northern side in the area of Bartanivka, Hitlerites quickly advanced to Bartanivka, where our divisional command post was located. We saw the Germans falling down, hit by the fire of our batteries, then went to tanks in the direction of the DKP, shelling it from guns. The situation was critical. At the 366th Anti-Aircraft Battery, on the initiative of the political officer of the battery Efimenko from the pits, advanced guns on the hillside and opened fire on the tanks, which were about 600 meters away. 2 tanks were destroyed, the third was hit. The other 3, after firing a few shots at the command post, fled in the direction of Yuchkivka. But the artillery shelling of the command post continued. We decided to withdraw to the 79th Anti-Aircraft Battery, located 700 meters from the ACS. Only 2 guns were serviceable on the battery. In total, 12 Red Fleet soldiers survived, and Petty Officer Commodore Grebenyuk, who continued to direct the fire from the surviving guns. I contacted by radio with the commander of the 110th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment, Colonel V.A. Mateev, reported the situation and received an order with the remaining 2 guns to arrive at Mikhailovsky Ravelin. Ignatovich arrived at the Ravelin with 18 redcoats and petty officers. With great difficulty, delivered anti-aircraft guns began to install on the north and east directions to be able to fire. During the installation of the guns, Ignatovich was severely wounded by a shrapnel from an exploded shell. On June 21, the captain was transported across the bay to a hospital. During the bombing of the hospital, Ignatovich was concussed. In serious condition, Evgeny Alexandrovich was sent to Novorossiysk. The commander of the 110th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment, Vasily Alexandrovich Mateev, took responsibility for organizing the defense of Mikhailovsky Ravelin. The first and second floors of the Ravelin were divided into sectors, and sector commanders and commissars were appointed. All window and doorways were assigned to groups of soldiers. The defenders prepared to stand to the death, but not to let the enemy through. Courage, selflessness, and comradely help in the battle showed everyone, recalls M.I. Beluka. The commander of the Abazia and former chief of the medical service, Efim Alexandrovich, Rogozin, wrote to me with great affection about doctors, surgeons D.S. Chepwatek, I.I.T. Bolsky, doctors M. I. Krateseski Grivich, nurses T.M. Veliko, Engri Yumeshkova, 3. I. Donchenko, about orderlies Elena Polyakova, Anastasia Ogorodnikova, Nadezhda Ivanova, orderlies N.K. Skirko, P.N. Timbaliuk, A. Baranchenko, M.V. Moros. The hearts of veterans Abkhazia rallied front friendship, writes Efim Alexandrovich. We organize meetings under the mottos, no one should be forgotten, nothing is forgotten. One of our last meetings took place in Odessa, where we passed the baton to the Komsomol of the Odessa Higher Marine Engineering School. Nurse Olga Gavrilovna Chubo writes, our motorship made more than one voyage to the besieged cities, transported tens of thousands of wounded and evacuees. One-way trip lasted 2 or 3 days. As a rule, there were no substitutes for us. We were on duty at the wounded. On the crossing we were bombed, and in the port. In addition to bombing, we were shelled with artillery fire. On other days, from dawn to darkness, the battle alarm was not cancelled. Stormy weather also happened. We experienced everything. I will never forget how the boatswain Sergei Skoromny carried in his arms burned, with a severed leg, but still alive political officer A.N. Volkovinsky. We medics could not save him. He died at the same time we buried him in a mass grave in Sukhanaya Bolkar. Evgeny Nikolaevich Volkovinsky enjoyed unquestionable authority among the crew. He was very much appreciated. He served as a model of fulfillment of military duty. On one of the voyages, Abazia received a significant batch of crates with bottles filled with flammable liquid. During unloading in Sevastopol, one crate fell into the hold. Everything was instantly enveloped in smoke and fire. Politruk led the emergency group and was the first to descend into the smoke-filled shaft, followed by the sailors. They were sprinkled with water from the deck. The fire was extinguished in 20 minutes. Ogi Chubo wrote many kind words about E.A. Rogozin. Risim Alexandrovich Rogozin, in a harsh environment, managed to cement the entire medical staff into one hardened, friendly family. Besides, he is a miracle surgeon. He made amputations and complicated operations at 910 Bale Storm. To him our low bow, but other veterans also write about Rogozin with love. Efim Alexandrovich, a party member since 1921, was a machine gunner in Budyonny's cavalry army. In the Civil War, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. He spent the whole patriotic war in the Black Sea Fleet. In 1950, he became a candidate of medical sciences. The theme of his thesis is the medical and evacuation activities on the ship Abazia. Olga Gavrilovna remembers well, and the last day of the life of the ship. We approached the pier of Sukhanaya Bolkar. Immediately after mooring, we started unloading and receiving the wounded. Dr. I.I. Tsibulsky was in charge of all this. He was truly tireless, always on the move, and most importantly, always had time for everything. And that day, Dr. Tsibulsky was in a hurry. There was a lot of work to be done. Nadia Zabolotnaya, Valia Makovozova, Sofia Shevlia, and I were preparing for surgery. As soon as they began to process those appointed for surgery, the air raid began. Bombs were bursting near Abazia. The whole ship was shuddering from bomb bursts. But the work in the operating room did not stop. After a direct hit in the stern, on the order of the commander, we started to carry the wounded ashore. We began to receive wounded from the crew of Abazia. Feldsheritsa Polishchuk rushed to the upper deck to help the wounded. Some of them, despite their wounds, continued to fire, but Polishchuk did not have time to help anyone. She was immediately struck to death. After another explosion, there was a fire. The political officer of BS5, the secretary of the party organization, ran to us with an exclamation, "X, hurry to the stern to put out the fire." We went upstairs and immediately heard the commander's order, "All leave the ship." The last to leave the Abazia was the commander M.I. Beluka. Mikhail Ivanovich left only when he was sure that none of the wounded and crew remained on the ship. Before him, the Commissar Noronov and the commander of BS5 Bardetsky went ashore. The evening came. The boats came, the wounded were transported to Inkerman Hospital, where part of the medical staff of Abazia went. The rest of the medical staff went to the 41st Naval Hospital. So the fate of nurses and orderlies who tied their fate with Sevastopol was difficult. Valentina Babenko, Lyubov-Shapetskaya, Olga Krupaderova and Valentina Makovozova stayed near the wounded until the last opportunity. Anastasia Ivanovna Ogorodnikova, who was an orderly on the Abazia, is now 74 years old. She was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War and 5 medals. At the very beginning of the war, at the call of the party, she volunteered for the sanitary squadron of Novorossiysk. She became a commander of a link of Komsomol women Druzhinaitsa, participated in unloading of sanitary transports, including Abazia. It was Anastasia Ivanovna who persuaded her unit to go as volunteer orderlies to the ship. Everyone was accepted. The girls were energetic and brave. Maria Morozova, Nadia Ivakina, Elena Polyakova, Galina Kalinaya Raya, 11 Komsomol girls. They tirelessly took care of the wounded, and in the decisive minutes of the battle, skillful girls' hands filled machine gun belts with cartridges. unloaded ammunition and food for the besieged Sevastopol. The girls fulfilled their duty until the last opportunity. After the destruction of the Abazia, the commanders and machine gunners of the transport joined the ranks of the defenders of Sevastopol. Few of them returned to the Caucasus. The rest of the crew members, together with the commander of the Abkhazia, M.I. Beluka, were taken on the cruiser Molotov to Novorossiysk. In one of his recent letters, Mikhail Ivanovich wrote to me, "After retirement, I've been working as a captain in Nikolaev port for 15 years. From day to day, I am going to take a vacation, but I do not dare to do it." His confession is typical for many veterans of the Navy. Recently, I received a letter from Grigory Onokolo. He writes about the last meeting with veterans of the Abkhazia, reminisces about his comrades in arms, speaks with love about his commander Beluka. For many months, Onokolo was hospitalized. In the end, he was recognized unfit for military service, but Grigory Ivanovich never stopped working. Now he is the chairman of Chimkent Regional Association Kazakhoz-Technica. For his labor activity, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, Badge of Honor, the Medal for Labor Distinction. In addition, he was awarded 5 medals of the All-Union Exhibition of Economic Achievements, one of them gold, for his military exploits GI. Onokolo was awarded the Medal for Bravery. Grigory Ivanovich has 2 sons. He instills in them a love of the sea, prepares them for service in the Navy. Invaluable movie footage showing the events of those days, the actions of people in the besieged naval base. The work of cameramen and photo correspondents often required courage, great self-control. This is how I knew Vladislav Vladislavovich Mikosha, among others in the Black Sea Fleet, who managed to film the destruction of the Abkhazia and leave to posterity a documentary movie story about selflessness of the crew of the Abkhazia and the defenders of Sevastopol. In the afternoon of June 16, the Germans broke into the Bratskoye Cemetery. This area was defended by the 95th Infantry Division, the headquarters of which was located in a shelter between the graves and under a low tower, which resembled an Egyptian pyramid. Hitlerites' breakthrough threatened complete encirclement of the headquarters of the Rifle Division. According to the terms of interaction in the headquarters was the liaison officer of the commander of Anti-Aircraft Division EA, Ignatovich, Staff Officer Lieutenant Colonel. Yakovlev instructed the liaison to get through the encirclement and pass a request to open fire on the Bratsk Cemetery. Under the cover of artillery fire, headquarters will try to get out of the encirclement. The contact got there. Ignatovich reported the situation to the commander of the 110th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment, Colonel A. Matveyev. On the Bratsk Cemetery opened fire. A few dozen shells dispersed the Germans and gave the opportunity to the headquarters of the 95th Division to go to the area of the engineering wharf. Ignatovich kept a note from Lieutenant Colonel Yakovlev. "Thank you, friends, that saved us out of trouble." In Sevastopol continued to operate scouts who carried out the tasks of the command. One of such reconnaissance groups, which remained in Sevastopol, was commanded by Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Fedorov. He arrived in the reconnaissance unit from the Maritime Army, in which he commanded a unit of military reconnaissance from the first days of the defense of Sevastopol. Courageous and enterprising commander scouts loved sincerely, and for cheerful disposition, inexhaustibility in jokes even in critical situations, and for reasonable strictness and exactingness, which helped in the performance of the most difficult tasks. June 17, Fedorov scouts in 3 groups on a patrol boat went to the area of Yelta. The task? To land on the shore for reconnaissance and disorganization of the enemy rear. The first group, under the command of Midshipman Alexander Ivanovich Popenkov, landed undetected. But when the boats of Senior Lieutenant Fedorov and Junior Lieutenant Sergei Melnikov began to approach the place of landing, the enemy found them, illuminated them with rockets, and opened fire. The boats withdrew. The second attempt to land was also unsuccessful. We had to move away from the shore again and go more seaward. Meanwhile, the fog had lifted, and the boats could not connect with the boat. Then Senior Lieutenant Fedorov decided to return to Sevastopol by dinghies. Dawn found the scouts at sea, but with the dawn came danger. Nearby enemy boats discovered our scouts and rushed to attack the boats. The brave men met the onslaught of Hitlerites steadfastly, having opened fire from all available weapons. Fedorov only reminded aim at the deckhouse. Gunners Ivan Pankratov and Alexander Ivanov fired from Fedorov's boat in short bursts. The fascists were not in debt. Their intense machine gun fire did not stop for a minute, but one German boat lost control and spun around on the spot, and then the second boat quickly came up, took the hit one in tow, and both began to leave. Junior Lieutenant Sergei Melnikov was wounded on the fore. It was his third wound. While still serving in the Marine Brigade, they tried to send him to the rear for treatment, but he categorically refused to be evacuated and under-repaired in Sevastopol. After some time again appeared boats, this time torpedo boats. Scouts met them with friendly fire, and again all attacks were repulsed. But Vladimir Gorbyshenko, who fought with the enemy until the last minute, died a brave death. Many on the Dinghais were wounded twice. Torpedo boats of the enemy, notwithstanding the fire and persistence of the scouts, went to the west at full speed. Once I happened to read the book The 10th Flotilla v. Bugesh, the commander of the Italian flotilla, which took part in blocking the besieged Sevastopol from the sea. On the 198th page, I read the description of the battle, which was conducted on June 18, 1942, 2 Italian torpedo boats with 2 Russian boats, Mersenya, Severochka. Vera Fedorovna's husband, Semyon Pavlovich, served on the Belostok as a helmsman. During the torpedoing, he was thrown off the bridge. His arm was broken, but Semyon Pavlovich kept afloat. When he heard Istomina, he swam up to his wife and supported her until the arrival of a patrol boat, which picked up the swimmers. Tells the Dr. Latfeu. Korenkova. My combat post was in Leninsky Corner. After the explosion, I ran out on deck, immediately felt the roll on the bow. Water was walking everywhere. Belostok was sinking fast. Noticing Zizek's indecision, I pushed her overboard. On deck, she could be caught in the whirlpool. After her, I jumped myself. Lenya Seminin threw me a cork bib. No one managed to get out of the cabins and cockpits. The commissar of the ship, political officer, Fyodor Ivanovich Marchenko, also died. The convoy ships picked up those who were kept on the water, 36 people in total. Together with them, the commander of the Belostok T.P. Rimkus was rescued, P. Rimkus. On June 8 in Novorossiysk port, another sanitary transport, motor ship Abazia, was preparing for departure to Sevastopol. Having received ammunition, food, medicines, and marching replenishment, Abazia, in protection of destroyer Svobodny, minesweepers, anchor and defense, and 3 sea hunters left at night to the besieged naval base. It was the 16th voyage of the ship since June 1941, and this time, as in all previous voyages, the ship was commanded by Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Ivanovich Beluka. I met him when the Abkhazia came to the fighting Odessa. I. Beluka was in those days a senior assistant, and the commander of the ship was Senior Lieutenant V. L. Zaikin. I remember well how important the help of this sanitary transport was. By April 12, 1942, Abkhazia transported to Odessa and Sevastopol troop replenishment. 71,352 men, 4,857 tons of ammunition and weapons, transported 27,807 wounded, evacuated tens of thousands of inhabitants of these cities and various valuable cargoes. Mikhail Ivanovich remembers well the last campaign of Abkhazia and told me about it in detail. They sailed, as usual, to Sinolu, then went up to Fiolant. At dawn the ship was covered by our bombers, and when they returned to the Caucasian airfields, U-87 and U-88 appeared. The guarding ships did not give the German bombers an opportunity to drop their bombs. The fire of Abkhazia also forced Hitler's pilots to turn away from the combat course. The commander of the artillery combat unit, Senior Lieutenant Anokin, in a very difficult situation, calmly and calculatingly led the firing. The commanders of 45-men batteries, machine gunners, especially the crews of numerous counter-weapon machine guns, were firing accurately. Sailors were tirelessly helped by girls' sanitary workers. The courage of the girls especially impressed Mikhail Ivanovich. All girls were volunteers, some had wounds and contusions, but none of them left the ship for treatment, seeking permission to stay on the Abkhazia. In May and June days, during especially difficult campaigns, some of them could go to the shore service, to the hospital. But the riskier the conditions of breaking the blockade became, the firmer was the desire of everyone to stay on Abkhazia. The last voyages were characterized by exceptionally high patriotic rise of the whole crew. Awareness that the defenders of Sevastopol selflessly continue to defend the base of the fleet sharpened the sense of responsibility among the crew members of the ship, even more closely united everyone, from the sailor to the commander. This cohesion has been preserved to this day. All survivors of those who served on the Abkhazia still correspond and meet each other. Mikhail Ivanovich Paluka told with great respect about the commander of the electromechanical combat unit, Chief Mechanic Anton Bardetsky. He worked miracles with his machine crew. In one of the voyages to Sevastopol, Abkhazia, passing by Kamyshev Bay, was blown up on a magnetic mine. In unusually difficult conditions, in total darkness, the seriously damaged ship reached the South Bay. Moreover, a day later the ship was able to receive the wounded and leave for the Caucasus. Grigory Ivanovich Onokolo, the commander of the signalling section, was always the first to detect an enemy plane. And on the day of Abkhazia destruction, Petty Officer Onokolo was on the bridge next to the commander. Having seen that the bombs dropped by the Junkers were flying at the ship, the petty officer covered the commander and was seriously wounded by shrapnel. Grigory Ivanovich was treated in hospitals for many months, but remained an invalid. In the days of the breakthrough to Sevastopol, I had to be on sanitary transports. As a rule, in these campaigns, the commanders did not leave the bridge neither day nor night, and the commissars were always there where it was especially dangerous. I did not hear anyone from the crew complaining of fatigue or excessive difficulties. Some of them themselves wondered where their strength and endurance came from. All had one goal: to deliver to Sevastopol everything necessary for the continuation of the fight and to take out the wounded. Grigory Onokolo wrote to me many years later. All of us, transporting the wounded, always took them in excess of the norm, brotherly conceded to the defenders of Odessa and Sevastopol not only cabins, fleet rations, but also gave the seriously wounded their blood for their salvation. Doctors, nurses, and orderlies courageously overcame difficulties, undividedly gave all their strength to the service of the wounded, and still they spoke frankly many times about how they were afraid and hard for themselves, for the wounded during difficult operations under bombardment and during the rocky weather. Doctors operating on a wounded man during the storm were tied to the operating table with belts. During the period of combat campaigns on the Abkhazia, 9,000 operations were performed. About one-third of them were done by the chief of the ship's medical service, EAA. But I will return to the story about the last, tragic for Abkhazia Day. With the onset of darkness, in the evening of June 12, attention was focused on possible attack of torpedo bombers. And so it happened. But this time the fire of the guarding ships threw the torpedo bearers off the battle course, and the torpedoes passed the target. By midnight the ship approached the fairway No. 3. The trawler No. 27 was waiting for Abkhazia. Before dawn came to Sevastopol, and not without difficulty moored at the first pier Sukhanaya beam. The weather was fresh, however immediately began unloading. Ships and transports coming to Sevastopol were covered with a smoke screen during the day to prevent Hitler's planes from bombing at least to some extent. And that time at dawn, as soon as enemy planes appeared, Abkhazia was covered with dense smoke. Our fighters were also guarding the transport, but fascist fighters and bombers were prevailing in the air. Simultaneously with the unloading, we started to receive wounded. They were delivered directly from the front line. The front was behind Sukhanaya Balka, 4 or 5 kilometers from the shore, on Abazia. Despite the rumble of cannonade and explosions of bombs and shells, we could hear gun and machine-gun fire. Although a smoke screen was put up, the enemy knew where the transports were coming and was firing artillery. However, the shells burst on the mountain or with a flight, there were no direct hits. Airplanes bombed the supposed parking places of transports without any results. Mikhail Ivanovich was disturbed by the wind, driving the smoke screen to the shore, and his alarm was not in vain. At 8 a.m., Deputy Chief of Fleet Staff Captain First Rank Vasiliev called the commander of the Abkhazia and transmitted. General Petrov asks not to put a smoke screen. Created a threat to the front on the north side. It turned out that under the cover of smoke, the enemy began to seep through the front line. We had to stop the smoke. All operating rooms on the ship were filled with the wounded who needed urgent operations, so some of the wounded were evacuated to the adits. And in the air rattled battle. Our fighters fought off the attacking messes and therefore could not cover the Abkhazia. Junkers were coming to the ship one after another to bombard it. The bombs were bursting near the transport and on the shore. A hail of stones fell on Abkhazia from explosions on the mountain. they found a way of defense against them. Many wicker chairs remained on the ship from peaceful times. Those who were on the deck raised them above themselves. A kind of umbrella was created. It was difficult to hide from small fragments of high explosive bombs. But they also found some salvation from them. Signalmen, commanders and machine gunners, despite the heat, put on coats and half-coats, and small fragments of high explosive bombs got stuck in their fur. As soon as the smoke stopped, the barge, where the ammunition was unloaded, received a direct hit. The barge sank. The second barge caught fire, but it was saved. The defense of the ship in these difficult hours took on the anti-aircraft gunners Malakoff-Kurgan. Junkers were forced more than once to drop their cargo in the side of the mound, although clearly held the course of Abazia. The first direct hit the transport received in the stern. It happened around noon. There was a fire, but under the leadership of Bosun Sergei Yakovlevich Skoromny it was quickly eliminated. Among the commanders and machine gunners were killed, including machine gunner Alexander Sokolov, a Sevastopol resident. The place of the fallen in the battle was taken by Yakov Ivanovich Kovalenko, the same one who stood behind the wheel during the mooring and in the most difficult moments accurately and quickly carried out the commander's orders. I keep the letters of I.I. Kovalenko. With love he writes about his friends, dead and alive. I will never forget our bosun Sergei Yakovlevich Skoromny. He served with us since 1930. On the day of destruction of Abkhazia, communist Sergei Yakovlevich, until the last minute, was directing a hose with water to the fire that was burning on the stern of the ship. Yakov Ivanovich recalls how the whole crew loved Abkhazia, one of the first ships built at the Baltic shipyard. He remembers how the ship visited Genoa in 1934 and took on board a dear guest, Maxim Gorky. And at 10 o'clock 4 bombs hit the hold No. 3 and the engine room at once. The fires started again. Abkhazia settled down and began to lurch to the starboard side. The commander, seeing that the ship was doomed, ordered to carry the wounded ashore and the medical staff and crew to leave the ship. With the arrival in the port, the crews of the ships immediately started unloading, sending the wounded to the sanitary train and to the sea hospital. Ship's doctor of the second rank GP Konstantinov and secretary of the party Bureau A. Dukachev were engaged in sending the wounded all night. And further I will give the story of Andrei Stepanovich Dukachev. In the morning I was walking along the pier, where lay on stretchers wounded waiting to be sent to the hospital, and suddenly heard someone's voice. Uncle Andrei. Uncle Andrei. I stopped. I looked with my eyes for the one who had called me. I noticed a man raised on his elbows. I looked at the half-childish face lying on the stretcher, straining my memory. Who is it? Eyes burning with feverish fire. A thin, expressionless face with a pointed nose. A body covered with a grey soldier's overcoat up to the waist. I look, and I can't remember. Don't you recognize me, Uncle Andrei? I'm Zenka, a neighbour of your nephew Kolka. I'm from Stalingrad, from Aviatsenaya Street. I remember. How did you get here, Zenya? And Zhenya told me about his war journey. Together with Kolya, they left as volunteers. Zhenya was barely 16 years old at that time. He added a year to his age, went to the military enlistment office and was accepted. After a short training in the spring of 1942, Zhenya got to Sevastopol. He fought on the Mackenziev Mountains. He was the second number at a machine gun. He was wounded, he was treated. He joined the ranks again. On June 14, when repulsing the attack killed a comrade, the first number. Zhenya replaced him and fired himself as long as there were cartridges. And then Hitler's planes came, bombed, shelled. Zhenya was shot in both legs. By night, my sister came crawling, dragged me away, and here I am already in Novorossiysk. I'll heal up and return to Sevastopol. It wasn't easy for me and the doctor to look at this boy, and at the same time we were proud of our people who had such children. And now, many years later, when we veterans hear the song which has such words, "Boys, boys, the country will be covered with yourselves," we remember meetings with young fighters of our fatherland. To the story of Andrei Stepanovich, it is necessary to add that till now he has not stopped searching for Zhenya, whose trace was lost on the roads of war. Maybe the readers of my book know something about that boy of the distant 42nd year. Steps to Sevastopol in the first half of June were difficult and risky even for such a class of ships as cruisers and destroyers, although their armament posed a danger to aircraft and submarines of the enemy. And yet, along with destroyers, cruisers, Fast minesweepers in June were sent to the breakthrough in Sevastopol passenger ships and transports of the Black Sea Shipping Company, which, although they went under the cover of warships, but were exposed to very great risk. About one of such ships, which made 3 trips to the besieged Sevastopol in those June days, I want to tell you in detail. Belostok was a merchant passenger ship, which arrived from Spain with children during the fascist putsch. Back in the summer of 1941, from the first days of the siege of Odessa, they often appeared in Odessa port, delivering ammunition, food, troops to the city, and taking away the wounded and evacuees. All of us had a deep respect for the commander of Belostok, Konstantin Kramarenko, and the crew of the ship for their ability to make quick transitions, to deliver valuable cargoes in complete safety. Here Admiral G.V. Zhuzhukov, commander of Odessa Defense, found time to visit the ship when it came to the port. The commander was connected with Bialystok by Viz combat pass. Gavril Vasilievich was among the volunteer sailors, participants of the battles in Spain, and therefore he always tried to find time to remember his combat past, to share his experience in the fight against fascism. Especially significant was the work of the ship's medical staff. The former chief of sanitary service, Bialystok Surgeon I. Estaimnov, who sailed on this ship until the last day of the siege of Odessa, told, in addition to the 2 of us, there was also a senior paramedic communist Savchenko, paramedic Malamud, and 7 girls, sanitary teams who graduated from short-term nursing courses. On the shoulders of this small team of medical workers lay a large and heavy physical work to receive the wounded, care for them during the voyage. Each girl had her own group of wounded. The nurses delivered food, changed bandages, delivered the wounded to the dressing and operation block. It was especially difficult during artillery shelling and bombing. Taking care of the wounded required a lot of physical exertion, which the girls managed to get used to. It was more difficult to hold back, to be calm, caring. When the ship was shuddering from bombs bursting near the ship, when the shelling of enemy coastal artillery was particularly intense. The whistle of shells, crackle of machine gun bursts, howling of Hitler's diving planes. All this had a depressing effect on the wounded, but the presence of cheerful nurses, Vera Melnishenko, Galina Korob, Nina Yakovleva, and other medical workers, their calm and caring care brought back to the wounded vigor, confidence in the safe and soon completion of this unusually difficult campaign. On June 11, Belostok, in the guard of fast minesweepers Blast and Trail, and 3 sea hunters delivered to Sevastopol replenishment. 370 soldiers, 227 tons of ammunition, 70 tons of food and 50 tons of gasoline. It was the second trip of Bialystok to Sevastopol. During unloading and receiving the wounded at the place of anchorage, the fascists dropped more than 20 bombs, but there were no direct hits. Shrapnel and explosive waves knocked out several people from the crew. Wounded and contused delivered wounded received new wounds and contusions. Shrapnel took out women and children who were on the upper deck. There were among them also contused. At this time, the Bialystok received more than 400 wounded and 70 evacuated. Under the cover of guarding ships, Belostok left the fairway No. 3 and took a course to Novorossiysk. Attacks of enemy torpedo boats were unsuccessful. At 5 a.m. on June 12, 90 miles south of Cape Meganom, Belostok was attacked by 6 torpedo boats. The minesweepers and sea hunters managed to dislodge the enemy planes from the combat course with their fire. All 12 torpedoes passed the target. But the enemy planes persistently pursued the convoy. Before the appearance of our aviation, covering the convoy, Junkers groups flew up to the ships and bombed them. At the same time, with aviation acted torpedo boats of the enemy. They were firing on the bridges of the Blast and on the minesweepers were killed and wounded. However, the guarding ships courageously covered the floating hospital and conducted continuous fire on the enemy planes. Only the appearance of our aviation forced the Nazis to move away from the convoy. And this time Bialystok safely reached Novorossiysk. It is difficult to tell what was experienced by the wounded women and children during this campaign. How many kind words of gratitude were said to girls and doctors, who were with the wounded all the time and helped them as they could. After sending the wounded to hospitals, the crew mostly by their own efforts repaired the damage received during the campaign, and on June 16 Bialystok again began to receive cargo for Sevastopol. On June 17 Belostok went from Novorossiysk to Sevastopol for the 3rd time in the protection of BTS Anchor and 5 boats Mo 4. On board the ship was 341 tons of ammunition, 238 tons of food, 360 men of march replenishment. In the afternoon began group raids of Hitler's bombers. By evening the planes left, but experience suggested that at the approach to Sevastopol will begin attacks of torpedo boats and torpedo carriers. Gun and machine gun crews prepared for battle. We had to wait for a short time. With the appearance of enemy torpedo boats, fire guns and machine guns on the Bialystok did not subside for a minute. Orderlies and nurses, armed with hoses and soup cans, poured water on the hot barrels. Girls' hands quickly filled machine gun tapes and thus made it possible to fire continuously. How we rejoiced, calls Dr. Lydia Fedorovna Korenkova, when the fire of the convoy in Belostok was hit by a Nazi torpedo carrier and burning fell into the sea. On the night of June 18, the convoy entered the southern bay, which Hitlerites shelled. On the approach to the refrigerator shell killed the commander of the motorists department, Seryozha Maslichenko, a universal favourite, always cheerful. With dawn the artillery fire intensified. The enemy aviation appeared. Our fighters bravely pounced on enemy bombers, but got involved in the battle Messerschmitts, helping bombers to break through to the target. Then they decided to camouflage Bialystok. They lit smoke bombs on the deck, imitating the fire of the ship. The new commander of the Belostok, Lieutenant Captain T.T. Rinkus, ordered everyone who was not busy on watch in the gun and machine gun crews to go into hiding. Among those who came ashore was nurse Vera Fyodorovna Melnichenko, who was called Chishik because of her small stature. Melnichenko was wounded in the head by a shell fragment. She was bandaged, and Chishik remained in the rock. Bombs and shells did not hit Bialystok, but from the blast wave and shrapnel the ship still had damage, although the machines were not affected. As evening dusk fell, the commander ordered everyone to return to the ship and begin receiving the wounded. Chizhik was laid on the upper deck in the radio room. We left Sevastopol at 21:30, accompanied by a minesweeper and 5 patrol boats. On board Bialystok were 360 wounded and 25 women. Sevastopol was burning. The convoy was leaving to the south. The Sevastopol cannonade was getting fainter and fainter. By night came an unusual silence. Only the noise of working machines and fans could be heard. After midnight, we switched to readiness no. 2. It seemed that the danger had passed. The catastrophe occurred at 1 hour 48 minutes. Bialystok was 20 miles south of Cape Phelant. A double explosion was heard. It was attacked by enemy boats. Torpedoes hit the bow of the Bialystok. The ship stayed afloat for a few minutes. Only those on the upper deck were saved. In 1971, when Odessa honoured the participants of the defence of the hero city, I met with Vera Fedorovna Melnichenko. Her courage, selflessness during the war years are evidenced by combat orders of the Red Banner, Patriotic War, Medal for Bravery and others. Vera Fedorovna works in a hotel, alone brought up 2 daughters. Her husband tragically died already in peaceful days. Here is her story. Immediately after a strong explosion, I fell from the sofa on which I was laid Lydia Fedorovna Korenkova. I got out of the radio room. Water was flooding the deck. Belostok was tilting badly. Lydia Fedorovna, seeing me on the deck, ran up and pushed me overboard. She could not swim, began to choke, but still managed to grasp a wooden bar. Nurse Tonya Istomina swam up to her and, supporting her, began to call for Vera's husband. Before the June campaign's party meetings were held in all combat units. Communists discussed the upcoming breakthrough of the blockade, decided how to better prepare for a difficult and dangerous campaign, how to mobilize everyone to accelerate the unloading of the ship and receiving the wounded. The results of these meetings were reflected in strengthening the defense of Sevastopol and, especially, in the example of courage and self-control that the Communists showed in the campaigns. It was already dark when the cruiser Molotov entered the northern bay and approached Kilim-Ploshchadka. The destroyer Vigilant headed for the southern bay. It was difficult to moor. Both bays were shelled. Unloading began. At the same time took the wounded. Red Army soldiers and commanders with full dressing ran down the gangways to the pier in a continuous stream, unloaded military equipment. Cannons were fed ashore by the ship's boom. Boxes with ammunition were conveyed down to the pier on trays. The tugboat brought to the left side of the cruiser 2 dry cargo barges. 3 trays fed on them and began to unload ammunition from the left side. On one of the barges directly from the side of the cruiser unloaded bags and boxes of food. All this greatly accelerated the unloading. In a hurry, sparing no effort, unloaded ammunition, brought the wounded. Continuous chain went to the shipwomen and children, but the commander of the cruiser still considered it possible to help the besieged garrison and the fire of the main caliber. 2 bow turrets opened fire on the station Bekhizarai. Later it became known that during this shelling an enemy ammunition train was blown up. During the firing, told many years later S.V. Domnin, the explosion of the explosion, V. Domnin. The whole hull of the ship shuddered, the gangways fell, but the fire did not stop. Just as quickly unloaded ammunition and food, a continuous stream of wounded and evacuees went, but the stability of the cruiser had to be preserved somehow. Then the captain of Spee 10, with the nose of the tugboat against the side of the ship, began to work the machine at full speed as long as the station was shelled. Admiring the dedication of the Spee 10 tugboat crew and its captain, Semyon Vasilievich regretted that he had not kept the captain's name in his memory. The commander of the destroyer Vigilant, Captain 3rd Rank A.N. Gorshanin, was also instructed to shell 2 heights behind Balaklava, the villages of Lilac and Otradnoye. Fire-attacked, destroyer-corrected posts Sevastopol defensive area. Artillery firing Vigilant was very effective, and the commander of the Seaside Army, Major General I. Petrov, asked to convey to the crew of the destroyer army thanks for the fleet light. On June 13 at 2 hours 40 minutes, the cruiser Molotov, having taken on board 1415 wounded and 220 inhabitants, withdrew from Kelenplощadka and, leaving the bay, shelled the enemy troops concentrated in the area of Toropova Dacha, Sukaya, Balka, Alsiu and heights east of the village of Kamaray. The destroyer Vigilant took more than 300 wounded and on the way out shelled the area of Varnotka and the heights behind Balaklava. The accuracy of the ship's fire was largely determined by the precise work of navigators. At the Chersonese measuring mile they accurately determined their location and gave the correct data, although the firing was conducted on the map without correction. Having shelled the shore, the ships, in order to get away from the Crimean coast faster, developed a speed of 28 knots, high for this class of ships, and laid down a course to the south. In the morning of June 14, barely having time to unload in Novorossiysk port, Molotov again stood under loading of ammunition and food for the next trip to Sevastopol. Together with the cruiser took cargo and replenishment for the besieged garrison destroyer Bezuprekny, whose commander was Captain 3rd Rank P.M. Beryak, Commissar, Battalion Commissar V.K. Usachev, 4,000 soldiers and commanders. The remaining units of the 138th Rifle Brigade arrived marching companies, more than 600 tons of ammunition and food took over loaded ships. Cruiser and destroyer left Novorossiysk at 2 hours 20 minutes on June 15 and headed southeast, and with dawn went along the Turkish coast. And again a precise calculation. The cruiser and destroyer should have time in the darkness to enter Sevastopol, unload, take the wounded and evacuees, to strike a fire blow on the troops and firing positions of the enemy, and go to sea before dawn. Approached Sevastopol not from the south side, but from the southwest. Approach from the southwest again allowed to avoid meeting with enemy aircraft, but the difficulty was that did not burn long-range fire Inkerman Gate. Summer nights in the south are dark. It is difficult to make up one's mind. Slowly the cruiser approached the side gate. At midnight at 6 points south wind the cruiser, having passed the Boom Gate, took a course to the corner of Kelenplощadka and from the move gave anchor, approaching the starboard side to the place of mooring. It was June 16, 0 hours and 15 minutes. Mooring this time also became more complicated. There were no poles on the wall to attach the ends to. They were blown away by a direct hit of a shell. The tug Spit 10 was already gone. It had been sunk the day before by enemy planes. Bays and berths were still methodically shelled by the enemy artillery. Hitlerites knew that ships every night come to Sevastopol. Every minute was precious. In the darkness the enemy still could not conduct an aimed fire. And then petty officer of the first article, Communist Maximenko, appealed to the XO of the cruiser with a request to allow him to swim to deliver moorings to the boat. Having received the good, he tied the end of the hemp rope to his belt and jumped into the water. In a few minutes the cruiser was moored. 5 gangways and 8 wooden chutes were immediately fed to the ship. The replenishment fighters rushed to the pier. Exactly an hour later unloading on the cruiser finished. Personnel Artillery Combat Unit, BBC-2, began preparing for firing. Target designation and intelligence in places of concentration of military equipment and enemy troops, the commander of BS-2A. Drubal received immediately. Dubel received as soon as the cruiser came to Sevastopol, so the fire attack on enemy positions was calculated and accurate. During the unloading of the cruiser at the same time took the wounded. The task force of the Medical and Sanitary Department of the fleet, headed by Brigadier Afanasy Ivanovich Vlasov, made a lot of effort to bring the wounded to the berth by the arrival of the cruiser. Preparation for evacuation from frontline hospitals to the Caucasus. As always, were engaged in the head of the sanitary service of the Sevastopol Defensive Area military doctor, 1st rank M3, Zelikov, and the head of the sanitary service of the Primorsky Army military doctor, 1st rank D, G. Sokolovsky, thoughtfully prepared for the reception of the wounded and on the ships. Galley and boilers for tea on the cruiser and on the destroyer worked continuously. Naval officers and petty officers ran, but deftly and carefully brought from the shore on stretchers seriously wounded and placed them in cabins and cabins. How many wounded had to be taken out can be judged by the report for June 15 alone. Our losses in Sevastopol killed 760 and wounded 2,000. In the cruiser's wardroom, where the medical station was equipped, ship's military doctor of the 1st rank A.G. Shevtsov, one of the oldest doctors in the Black Sea Fleet, worked selflessly. Alexander Grigorievich graduated in 1918 in Nikolaev from the Marine Paramedic School, and in 1934, the Medical Academy named after S.M. Kirov, and knew his business perfect. He was considered one of the best surgeons in the fleet. Alexander Grigorievich, together with his assistants, until the very arrival in Novorossiysk, operated on everyone who needed surgery, and there were many of them. The cruiser delivered several hundred seriously wounded directly from the front line. The destroyer Impeccable moored at Sukhanaya Beam. The commander of the destroyer, Captain 3rd rank Peter Maximovich, Beryak, also managed to quickly unload the cargo delivered from Novorossiysk and take on board the wounded. The crew of this ship gained experience in transportation of ammunition and wounded during the days of campaigns in besieged Odessa. In the organization of all the work, the decisive role belonged to the assistant commander of the destroyer, Senior Lieutenant A.I. Kisel. In addition to outstanding organizational skills and cheerful character, he had great physical strength. If the senior lieutenant noticed an unexpected delay in loading or unloading, he often used his heavyweight strength, and the hiccup was quickly eliminated. All this was done at a fast pace, and the combat spirit of the senior lieutenant as best as possible transferred to the Red Fleet. In total, the cruiser and destroyer took more than 3,000 wounded and about 200 women and children. At 1:50 a.m. on June 16, Bezuprechny and Molotov were ready to sail. Turning the cruiser bow to leave without a tug was very slow. Captain 1st rank N. Besisti, who also in this campaign commanded the detachment of ships, stood on the bridge and watched how Romanov skillfully and confidently turned around with the help of their own machines. Soon the detachment was out to sea. The destroyer, Flawless, went in the lead. Senior Lieutenant Timothy Steblovsky, commander of BS-2, prepared all the data for firing. The commanders were only waiting for the command. From Inkamansky range destroyer, shelled the enemy positions in the Belbek area, and at the Chersonese measuring mile on the concentration of Hitlerites' reserves, the cruiser opened fire from the main caliber. A few days later, from the army reconnaissance, became known results. The cruiser and the destroyer that night inflicted a great damage to the enemy. The return was quiet. Not a single shot was not made anti-aircraft gunners during this campaign. The success of the breakthrough to Sevastopol was explained not only by the fact that the ships approached from the southwest direction, from where the enemy did not expect them, but also by the fact that the cruiser and destroyer were covered by our P-2 dive bombers. Even the fact that the speed of the ships had to be reduced to 14 knots did not affect the safety of the campaign. The destroyer did not have enough fuel oil for a full run. Basisti recalled later, "We could from the cruiser to give the destroyer fuel oil, but to do this would have to stop the move. It was dangerous. We could become a stationary target for enemy submarines, which prowled in the Black Sea quite a few. We arrived in Novorossiysk not by evening, as it was planned, but at 1 o'clock in the morning on June 17. The speeches were essentially vows. We will not give up the height. As long as there is at least one communist among us, the fascists will not pass. Then they held a Komsomol meeting, and the Komsomol swore that they would not shame the honor of the sons of Lenin's Komsomol. In recent years, I received several letters and from D.D. Skurda. Those who knew him during the war remember Dmitry Denisovich as an enterprising commander of the Instrument and Rangefinder Department. The 365th Battery had an outdated fire control device, the data from which were read by voice, i.e., the artilleryman watching the device shouted to be heard, but during firing the voice was still drowned out, and Skurda invented a system of telephonization, which allowed to receive in telephone headphones data, quietly read into the microphone. On Dmitry Denisovich's account, 26 killed enemies. Nestled in the pit of the instrument compartment, Skurda uninterruptedly fired, although during the battle the rifle heated up to the limit. Numbered sailor Fedorova and speed measurer Syzenko filled magazines and served him. In the December battles, Skurda was severely wounded and sent to the hospital. Dmitry Denisovich was awarded the Order of the Red Star. After hospital, Skurda fought near Novorossiysk. Tuapse was wounded again. Now he is a lieutenant of reserve. For about 20 years he has been working as a brigadier of Field Growing Brigade in the collective farm named after XII Party Congress in Pavlovka village, Bogoditufov district, Kharkov region. Skurda remembers a lot about his battle comrades on the 365th Battery. Dmitry Denisovich writes about his fellow countrymen. The commander of the 1st Gun Litovko, who fulfilled his military duty to the end, about Ivan Streltsov, with whom he then became firm friends. About Stefan Danik, former collective farm foreman, fearless fighter, who did not waver even when he was left alone of the entire gun crew, and continued to Hitlerites who were climbing on the battery. D. Skurda wrote about the communist Sergeant Shokoda. Before the war, Anton Shkoda was the chairman of the collective farm of Novomoskovsky district of Dnipropetrovsk region. At the battery, he showed the skills of an intelligent, thrifty host and a clever organizer. It is not by chance that he, the commander of the gun, was appointed foreman of the commanders. In the created mobile rifle group, which included riflemen, snipers and machine gun crew, Sergeant Shota became the commander. Being in a bunker on the southern slopes of the battery, they could see well the surrounding terrain and the advancing Hitlerites. When the enemy soldiers, having reached the wire fence, tried to make an attack, they were mowed down by shooters, snipers and machine gunner. There was a moment when the Nazis broke through to the firing position. It was possible to launch grenades, but it was inconvenient to throw a grenade from the bunker. The first to come out was the commander, as always and in everything. Communist Shkoda showed an example by his personal behavior. Shkoda fought with the enemies until the last breath. Quite recently I learned that Ignatovich Matveyev, an invalid of the first group, lives in Moscow. We met. We recalled Sevastopol. Efim Matveyevich told me about his comrades and himself. Until 1945 he was in hospitals, underwent more than one operation. The doctors preserved not only his life but also his ability to work. For his heroic deeds, Matev was awarded the Order of Lenin and the Order of the Red Star. Efim Matveyevich reminded me of our meeting in Tbilisi in 1942, in a hospital. My eldest son, Victor, was lying in the same ward with him after being wounded. I couldn't see very well at the time, recalls Yefim Matveyevich, and I was very much hoping for help from the famous Professor Filatov. With your letter addressed to him, my nurse and I were sent to Tashkent, where I underwent surgery. Though not completely, but still my sight was restored. Major General Iosif Kuzmich Semenov still keeps in touch with the surviving soldiers and commanders of the legendary battery. He often visited the positions of anti-aircraft gunners in the days of the defense of Sevastopol. Semenov helped me to say a kind word about the combat team, whose feat is inscribed in the history of the Great Patriotic War. The defenders of Sevastopol increasingly needed reinforcements. Fighters were out of service. There was a shortage of ammunition. In the scorching heat, the besieged suffered without water, saved breadcrumbs and canned goods. Every voyage to Sevastopol, the crews of all the ships of the Black Sea Fleet tried to use as efficiently as possible. By May 1942, the experience and skill of sailors allowed to carry out both the voyages and additional loading and unloading much faster than it was done before. Thus, on the cruise of Voroshilov, there were specially made trays for unloading ammunition boxes, ramps for rolling guns, vehicles, and camp kitchens. Everyone in the crew knew exactly his working place during the unloading of the ship and receiving the wounded, for whom additional stretchers were prepared. The commander of the cruiser Voroshilov was the oldest sailor, with a great practical experience of service in the fleet, Captain First Rank FAIS Markov. In 1915 he came to the fleet as a young man, participated in the revolutionary events. After the sinking of the fleet in Novorossiysk, together with Enwy Basistoy, he fought in the Volga-Caspian flotilla. In 1931 FS Markov graduated from the Naval Academy. In the squadron, at the head of which went in those May days in Sevastopol cruiser Voroshilov, were destroyers Subrazitelny, Swobodny. In one of the last campaigns in May, the detachment took the 9th Marine Brigade, 3,400 soldiers and commanders, 36 guns, 12 mortars, vehicles, and about 400 tons of ammunition. On board the cruiser Voroshilov was the commander of the Light Forces Detachment, Captain First Rank A. Basisty. Almost the whole way passed quietly, but on the approach to Sevastopol the detachment was attacked by bombing and torpedo-bearing aviation, but the ships not only repulsed all attacks, but even managed to destroy 2 He-101s. At the boom gate, a kind of ring fence suspended on barrels, fastened with a chain, the enemy torpedo carrier, already in the darkness, dropped a torpedo. It passed behind the stern of the cruiser and exploded near the shore, opposite the Chersonese Museum. Voroshilov moored at the pier of the northern bay, destroyers in the southern bay. Despite the fact that the bays were continuously shelled by artillery fire, the unloading of the cruiser took an hour and a half. Destroyers finished it a little earlier. Having received the wounded and evacuees, the ships still at night had time to go on the return voyage. And in May, the campaigns of ships to Sevastopol were associated with great risk. The sailors were required to show exceptional organization, great courage, endurance, and stamina. From the morning of June 10, after a powerful air and artillery preparation, the enemy resumed the offensive on the site cordon Mackenzie No. 1 Bekenzievi Gori station. The enemy's attacks in the direction of Sukhanaya Balka were not successful. All attempts of fascists to break through were reflected by our artillery in cooperation with aviation and infantry. Leaving 10 tanks out of 25, the Germans withdrew to the north. However, the enemy persistently sought to break through our defences and open the way to the northern bay. In this direction, the enemy concentrated 100 tanks. Our units, repulsing attacks, inflicted heavy losses to Hitlerites. 25 tanks were destroyed. Mackenzie Vigori station passed from hand to hand 3 times. By the end of the day, the enemy pulled up new reserves and seized the station. So Hitler's troops strengthened the blockade of Sevastopol. But surface and submarine ships of the fleet, transports continued to feed the port, take out the wounded and evacuate the civilian population. The cruiser Molotov and destroyer Vigilant were preparing for another campaign to Sevastopol. In Novorossiysk they took on board 3,300 soldiers and commanders of the 138th Separate Rifle Brigade, 28 guns, more than 300 tons of ammunition, and 1,000 automatic rifles. On June 10, after midnight, the ships left Novorossiysk to the southeast, and with dawn went along the Turkish coast. At dusk on the meridian of Sinop turned to Sevastopol. The commander of the cruiser Molotov, Captain First Rank MFF Romanov, and military commissar Battalion Commissar Im Kolabayev, even during the repair of the ship in Poti, learned that they have to break through to the besieged Sevastopol. Romanov and Kolabayev, having studied the lessons of the last campaigns of cruisers Voroshilov, Red Crimea destroyers, set before the commanders of combat units and party bureau task to take into account the experience of the ships of the squadron going to Sevastopol at that time. The responsibility of the upcoming campaign was clear to everyone, and the personnel of the cruiser, sparing no effort, did everything possible to reliably prepare for the breakthrough to the blocked base of the fleet. The first attacks of enemy bombers on the cruiser and destroyer began at about 8 o'clock in the evening. For half an hour the attacks did not stop. By fire and manoeuvring the ships avoided hits, and when there were low-flying torpedo carriers, the cruiser gave a salvo of main caliber. One of the torpedo carriers pecked the nose, raised a column of water, and in this campaign took part in Captain First Rank N.E. Basisty. The actions of the commander of the ship could not help but cause admiration and many years later Nikolai Efremovich. The cruiser maneuvered under the thunder of guns and invariably dodged direct hits. As soon as the bombs were separated from the bomber, Romanov gave a command to the rudder, translated the handles of the machine telegraph, then increasing or decreasing the rate. Everything was done quickly, confidently, cold-bloodedly. I also knew MFF Romanov well from our joint service on the Black and Baltic Seas. In any situation, calm Mikhail Fedorovich could quickly make decisions and clearly explain them to the executors. A commander of high maritime culture, Romanov always prudently prepared himself and his subordinates for the most difficult conditions of combat task fulfillment. Captain 3rd Rank SVLV. Domin, the cruiser's senior assistant commander, was also like the commander. More than one training session was held by the XO, and it allowed the personnel to unload the cruiser and take the wounded in the shortest possible time. Commissar Ivan Mikhailovich Kolobayev knew people well. The energetic, courageous and principled party leader was the secretary of the party bureau Andrei Stepanovich Dukachev. In one of the arrivals in besieged Sevastopol, being at the coal pier, the cruiser's crew unloaded ammunition under unceasing artillery fire. Enemy shells burst on the pier and over the cruiser. Wounded and killed appeared. There was a hiccup with unloading. Dukachev ran to the stack of cows, threw a box on his shoulders. "Let's go, communists!" And he ran to the gangway and to the quay. He was followed by communists, Bezhinov, the editor of the newspaper, and Sivak, a communist. There was no hiccup at all. The first award of SS Dukachev was a medal for bravery. In the June days of 1942, on the 365th Battery, fired 79th and 366th Batteries. The dense fire of anti-aircraft gunners covered the enemy. The Nazis probably did not expect that the hard-won height would bring them death. All personnel of the 365th Battery fulfilled their duty to the end. For many years it was thought that none of the heroes managed to save themselves. But it turned out that the commander of the 4th Gun, Sergeant Ignatovich Streltsov, survived. In 1965, in the newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, from December 31 was posted a note, "I was on the battery Pianzin." Streltsov read, "I managed to be a witness and participant in a tragic scene when our combat Ivan Semyonovich Pianzin called fire on himself by radio. Being wounded, Senior Lieutenant Pianzin still found the strength to decide on the last resort to fight the enemy." In 1971, I received several letters from Ivan Ivanovich, living in the city of Bakhmuk, Chernigov region. II Streltsov is retired, but continues to work. He has 2 daughters and a son. Ignatar Ivanovich reported, "I myself do not know how I stayed alive. In those minutes when the battery commander was dictating to the radio operator, I was lying near Pianzin. At times I lost consciousness, but I remembered the commander's words, 'Ubai, comrades. We are dying, beat the enemy.' I remember how the shells of our batteries were bursting at the firing positions. I saw the killed Hitlerites, saw the fascists running from the battery. The blast wave threw me away. I lost consciousness again. I came to my senses at night. I did not immediately realize where I was and what was wrong with me. I couldn't see very well. I touched my eyes. There was a crust of blood on them. I'd been wounded in the head. I crawled down from the heights with great difficulty. I tried to get up, but couldn't. I cried in frustration. Tears blurred my eyes. I began to see better. I crawled towards the northern bay, sometimes losing consciousness. I knew the area well. That's why I crawled to my own. I was taken to the hospital and immediately put on the operating table. The doctors saved me. I remember that our former Commissar Alexei Donyushkin came to me. He was transferred from the battery to the commissar of the division. He asked me how everything was. I told him. He kissed me and left. A few days later I was sent to Novorossiysk, the leader Tashkent. 3 decades separate us now from those tragic events. During these years it was possible to establish that not only I Streltsov survived. Among the rescued anti-aircraft gunners, I Shaliga D. Tiskerda, VP Alexandrov. In 1971, I had a witness and participant of the last battles of the 365th Battery, Ivan Ivanovich Shaliga. In those days he commanded an anti-aircraft machine gun squad, was a petty officer of the 2nd Article. On the account of his squadron, 3 shot down enemy aircraft. Ivan Ilarinovich got to the 365th Battery among 40 volunteers sent to help the battery from the units of the 61st Anti-Aircraft Regiment. More than half of the volunteers were from the machine gun battalion. Almost all of them were communists and Komsomol members. Lieutenant Boris Stepanovich Pastintsev commanded the group. By the evening of June 10, the group prepared for departure. We knew what we were going for, Ivan Ilarinovich told. You and swore to fight to the last drop of blood. All were armed with rifles. Everyone had more than 100 rounds of ammunition and grenades. We took with us a big tank with drinking water. 2 trucks drove us to the Bratsk cemetery. We got off. It was hard to carry the tank, but we dragged it. We knew that there was no water on the battery. The guide was the commissar of the battery, senior political officer I. Uvarov, who had arrived the day before. He told about the situation at the battery. Despite the shelling, frequent launches of flares, the commissar led the entire group to the position. Pyanzin, Uvarov and Pastintsev distributed the arrivals to firing points trenches. Shovels went into action. It was necessary to free the trenches from the rubble. On the northern side made a cell for a machine gun. The commander of the machine gun was Sergeant Minasov. In the western direction, Sergeant Smirnov equipped a position for a machine gun. 7 soldiers entrenched with him. 16 men were assigned to cover the CP, led by the group commander Lieutenant Pastintsev. Petty Officer 2nd Article Shaliga was ordered to take a firing position in the area of the guardhouse. His squad consisted of Mikhailev, Marchenko, Vandyushenko, Shmel, Shepalev, Novikov and Sklyarenko. In addition to each having a rifle, the group was given a machine gun. Not far from where we were stationed, Ivan Ilarinovich recalled, stood the 4th gun of Sergeant Ivan Streltsov. A large shell pierced the barrel at the muzzle of the gun. It was dangerous to fire from it, but there were no more guns on the battery. Then Streltsov loaded the cannon, hid in cover and fired. The cannon that had been hit was still operational. Streltsov managed to save his gun until the very last battle. With dawn, Hitlerites started shelling the battery. Sometimes they came so close that sometimes in the moments of silence we heard their voices. I remember well the last day of the battle. At dawn of the 13th, under cover of a smoke screen, artillery and mortar fire went tanks. Sergeant Streltsov from his crippled gun hit the lead tank. The German gunners lay down. Pyanzin personally from the anti-tank gun hit the second tank, and then a direct hit of a shell finally put Streltsov's gun out of action. Lieutenant Pastintsev and Red Fleet Koltarkov hit the tank climbing to the heights with anti-tank grenades. But enemy machine gunners had already penetrated to the firing positions. Pastintsev was seriously wounded. Sergeant Sergeyev and Koltakov carried the lieutenant to the shelter. In the trenches hand-to-hand combat, all of Shaliga's squad were wounded. Several men were killed. Shaliga was wounded too. It grabbed a grenade with a wooden handle thrown by the Nazis and managed to throw it back, but the grenade exploded in the air and a splinter crashed into Shaliga's chest. The petty officer was dragged to cover by Mikhailev, though he was wounded too. Memory has not preserved all the details. Ivan Ilarinovich remembers how at night he, Mikhailev, Marchenko and Vanyushenko got out of the blocked dugout. They were crawling towards the bay and were spotted by the Germans. Mikhailev had a grenade. He threw it towards the Germans. The explosion attracted the enemy's attention. Rockets flew in the direction of the explosion. Mikhailev, Marchenko, Vanyushenko, and Shaliga crawled in different directions. Ivan Shaliga reached at dawn to the wire fence in the area of Sukhanaya Bolka. Our fighters picked him up and took him to the hospital. The wound was heavy, and Shaliga was sent by plane to Krasnodar. In Kislovsk, in the hospital, he met with Mikhailev, Marchenko and Vanyushenko. After being cured, Ivan Ilarinovich fought in the Marine Infantry. He finished the war with the rank of lieutenant. Now works as a driver in Yalta trolleybus. The story about the heroes of the 365th Battery. I started the book because the people of this land firing point especially remembered me in connection with the events that determined the heroic nature of the 250-day defense of Sevastopol. In the April days of 1942, 35 people from the personnel of this battery were awarded battle orders and medals. April 15 became a holiday for anti-aircraft gunners. The distinguished were awarded. The greeting of the Military Council of the Black Sea Fleet from April 14, 1942 was read out. To the commander of the 365th Battery, Lieutenant Vorobyov N. To the commissar of the 365th Battery, Political Officer Danyushkin A. In the battles for the Soviet motherland against the German invaders, The personnel of your battery showed an unforgettable example of courage, bravery, discipline, and organization. In a difficult moment, when the fierce enemy was rushing to Sevastopol, the capital of the Black Sea sailors, his furious attacks crashed on the iron strength of your steadfastness. Congratulating the personnel of the battery with high governmental awards, the Military Council expresses its firm confidence that in the future you will heroically fight for the motherland, for the Soviet people. Among the awardees were S. Dunik, A. Shodder, I. Streltsov. The awarding and greeting of the Military Council were received by the artillerymen with great joy and pride. It gave people new strength, once again strengthened the conviction in our final victory over the Hitler invaders. I remember what a great impression the defensive structures on the battery made on me. The anti-aircraft gunners did not move away from the guns during the day, and at night everyone was engaged in defense work. Several strong pillboxes were built, 50-60 meters away from the guns, trenches with overlaps. But I was especially surprised when the battery commissar Donyushkin showed me a bathhouse built by his own forces. There was even a regiment for those who liked to take a steam. I remembered the commissar's story about the selflessness of the soldiers of the battery in the days of the December offensive on Sevastopol. Tanks were coming to the battery. The commander of the second gun, Stepan Danish, was the first to open direct fire and hit one tank. The fascists intensified the shelling of the position. From Danich's gun crew, all were put out of action. Stepan alone continued to direct fire shrapnel at the advancing enemy. You had to see everything with your own eyes, said the commissar, to imagine what damage we then inflicted on the enemy. That day, Danich, among many, submitted an application to the party organization with a request to be accepted into the ranks of the All-Union Communist Party. I want to fight the fascists as a communist, he wrote. Communist Ivan Streltsov, commander of the 4th gun, noticed Hitler's machine gunners approaching the firing position where his gun was located. Despite the wound, Streltsov with a grenade climbed the berm and threw it at the Hitlerites. The courage of the men was extraordinary, especially after the commissar of the division, senior political officer V.B. Barakin, visited the battery and reported that a landing force had landed on the Kerch Peninsula. We held a meeting of communists, inviting those who applied for admission to the party. We need to stand. Barakin finished his short speech.